All right. Hey guys. Already got a first statement by somebody. Um, oops, I have a couple notes for myself on the screen. I can go back to that, but I'll just put this on the screen for now. um, hey guys. I am just going to obviously getting the ball rolling today with this webinar. I don't know exactly how it'll go. No big promises. But I'd like to certainly start getting a better sense start getting feedback with you guys and with people to see what people are getting in terms of the law of implication, where you're benefiting, and also where people might be stuck, and start getting a sense of questions. I don't know if I'll get to all questions or what today, or if there'll be many questions or how it'll go. But as I said, we'll get the ball rolling, and that'll be great. Um, at some point in the future, I don't know, 1, 2, 3 years, I will be, of course, taking law of implication more widely to the world. But this is a nice kind of incubation period where I'll get a base of support and feedback and get it all honed and so forth. And of course, you guys will benefit a lot from it as well as you follow along. But it can make law of implications seem kind of artificially small right now. But I don't think it'll be a small thing over the coming years in the world. But for now, I'm just kind of incubating it and getting stuff straight and getting used to bridging it to people and getting my ability to explain it and examples and everything better and better. Very nice. One person says, I have an idea for helping spread your ideas, by the way. I appreciate that very much. Okay, it says you can't see the screen. Let me see here. There we go. Now you should be able to see my screen. It's nothing special right now. just I have my usual slides. Got it. Okay, great. Now you can see it, right? All right. Now, in terms of, what I'll do is I'll take a look at questions that might start coming, and then I'll see if that can get us started. I could share some thoughts, but I also, the more I can gear it toward questions, the better. If people do ask questions like, could you give an example of such and such, I appreciate all questions, but ideally is when one of the things I get stuck with as I try to explain things is coming up with examples. I tend to kind of come up with the same type of examples in a few kind of limited topics in life. My own brain goes when I'm thinking about this stuff and thinking about what to talk to you guys about. One of my struggles is with public policy tends to be on my mind a lot these days, and I try to limit that. But I personally, it's interesting to me. But I know in OMG I try to keep the topic at least reasonably skewed towards money getting and so forth. But anyhow, with myself, examples get kind of incestuous or whatever. So if people give me some specifics, sometimes that can be helpful as well. All right, I'm now going to start taking a look here at what's going on with the questions. Give me a moment. Let me start with a question. Somebody asks, I have a crazy hard time getting stuff done. I break down trying to complete things the right way. Now, I can assure you that when I give some answers to these questions later today, I'll think of something better I probably could have said and so forth. So when I'm doing recordings for law of implication, I pause it a lot and I think for a lot. So, but still, I wanted to start this discussion in question and answer format and see how it goes. Let's see here. One thing when you want to get things done. Now, the law of implication in general is the idea is you begin with what you know. You focus on what you can know, and you continue from there, where you generally don't have to stop doing that in life. When you start focusing on what you know, and I give the kind of general example of two types of people trying to do a difficult math problem in school. The person who's effective at doing that, if you interview them or you talk to them, what their general way of doing it is neither the good person nor the bad person at doing like a math problem like that, neither of them really knows the answer to start with. And I'm talking about problems that are hard where that's normal to not know the answer. But then the person who does it effectively just starts to write down and think about and focus on what they potentially know regarding that question, like possible formulas that might work, or they might try writing down some of the parameters that the question gives, and then try starting with one formula. If it doesn't seem to work, they go to something else. But they just keep building on what they know, rather than just kind of free associating and thinking of trying to come up with a template or a conclusion or panic because they don't know the answer. So regarding this question about trying to get stuff done, if you start to focus on what you know, like let's say you want to, obviously you could start like ranking a website. We can use an example, and you want to sit down in front of the computer. And now this kind of brings up a second question of, well, what do you know regarding that? Or that the way you'd want to approach the idea of ranking a website if you are getting started is you want to start to accumulate things you know. Again, by the alternative or the typical way or default way of thinking, then what people want to do is they want to start with a conclusion and then work from there. So if someone using the typical way of thinking, if they want to rank a website, they feel like they should know what to do, or else there's a problem. Like they want to kind of have a conclusion of how to do it before they get started with the task. But in life, the more you can let go of needing to start with a conclusion, the better. And it's really, 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 really natural to do that. It's literally, you don't feel like you're past step one unless you have some sort of at least tentative conclusion or some idea. Like someone who doesn't know how, like if someone who's sitting down, they want to rank a website, they'll feel like kind of panicked or something is really wrong if they don't know what to do, right? Like they should have some working hypothesis, they feel like. However, the more you can get comfortable in life with instead of having an idea of how to do it, instead you just have an idea of what you might know that might be related or helpful. So you might say, all right, look, if I'm going to be ranking a website, I'm for sure going to need to be sitting in front of my computer and not like doing something else. So you might just start by, and now this may or may not work when there's also going to be, there's kind of like an iteration or if you know those Russian Matryoshka dolls where you open one doll and then there's a smaller one inside and so forth. What you're going to find in life when you're trying to come up with the answer to a particular question, or which can also mean how do I do this task, or how do I rank a website is an example of a question. So any kind of goal you have can be rephrased as a question, right? Like how do I achieve this goal most efficiently? So the first thing you can do is just sort of start on a bit of the surface or kind of within the paradigm that you're operating with. And so it might just be enough for you to say, I'm going to sit in front of my computer and then I'm going to start somewhere that might be relevant. Either I know the first thing I need to do, it certainly has to be registered the domain and hosted and have WordPress on it. If I don't have those things done, then I do that. If I don't know, so I know I might need to start with those things. If I don't know how to do it, then I can at least go and watch a video, but then I'm watching the video in order to go and get that done. Often people conceptually try to swallow a whole task at once in their head, and if they don't feel like they have a conclusion in their mind about how to do the whole task, they'll feel like not getting started, like it's too hard. This whole idea, the more you can let go in life of needing to have a conclusion about how to do something before you start, the more you can realize that you are making progress if you're building understanding. A little bit like me doing this webinar. There's a lot I'm basically doing this webinar in order to understand how to start doing live law of implication webinars, if that makes sense. And to the extent that I was waiting to imagine the whole process being very successful, if I were to imagine trying to figure out how to make like the movie Braveheart, and that speech he gave with fireballs coming out of his arse and so forth, if I needed to figure out how to give a speech like that and really rile people up, and if I was thinking, okay, I need at the end of this webinar, people have to really get it and they have to really love me and be pumped up, and I need to get all sorts of great feedback. If that was something I felt like I needed a working hypothesis or a conclusion of how to do before I got started, then it would cause me to want to procrastinate. And to the extent that I did want that, then it would be causing me to procrastinate. Although what I think was my least justification for not doing it until now was that I wanted some basis and I didn't want to get a false feeling of progress. I wanted to get a certain number of recordings finished before I got to this point. But one way or the other, if you're trying to get something done, then if you are just trying to accumulate things that you know, and when I say things that you know, it doesn't have to be on a super deep level, right? Like if you've never swam before and you want to learn how to swim and you get in the pool, then at least in the way that I'm speaking now, at least you can say, I know what it was like getting into the pool, right? And then if you try doing a little bit of swimming, at least you know what it was like to try. So for the moment, I'm just using a pretty simplistic idea of talking about what you know. But it's still very effective, even with that simplistic idea. So if you shift your frame of accomplishing tasks and achieving goals and answering questions to one where you can sit down and you're not setting yourself. Normally people set themselves up for failure as a matter of habit without really realizing it. And I don't mean that they set themselves up where they're definitely going to fail, but they set themselves up where there's a possibility that they're going to fail when even that possibility isn't necessary. For example, I don't ask people questions. And as you can see in general, I'm using these questions as a springboard to explain things. I'm not necessarily trying to get to every question in this format, but as long as I'm kind of have a back and forth going a little bit. So sorry, I interrupted myself. I am able to pretty much never, or literally never perhaps, as far as I can remember for a while, never really ask people questions where they can fail with their response. Like, just to give a simple example, if you ask a child, did you brush your teeth? Meaning, and there's a right answer and a wrong answer, then you've set them up for potential failure. Or if I call one of our coaches up and say, hey, did you do the webinar this way? Whereas there's kind of a right answer and a failure answer, then I don't ask questions in that way. Instead, I would say something like, if I have to say it, then I will state what I think the correct answer is up front. Like I'll say, I'm hoping that you'll do webinars, in the following way. Also, I don't really set things up where I have one of the things we can know in life is it makes no sense to have a goal for something you can't change, such as something in the present or the past. But people also do that nonstop. Even something as simple as worrying about checking your mailbox, email or snail mailbox, because something bad might be in there. If you hope for it to be a certain way, but it's already whatever emails in your inbox is in there. If you habitually have or ever have goals for things that you logically can't change by your own worldview, you can't change them, then that's just going to kind of disturb you, right? You're setting yourself up for failure in different ways where you can't, where there's the possibility of it, when with a little bit of thought or understanding, you can do things differently. And I find it doesn't inconvenience me at all. It just makes my life better and the people's lives around me. But I never need to ask a question where there's a failure response. Similarly, if I'm going after a goal, or with this webinar here myself, this is kind of new for me doing this, in terms of what I'm looking to get, I can't really fail because I'm just setting myself up to gain understanding one way or the other. And now I temper that a little bit where, of course, I put enough thought in that it's not going to be something that's going to just take me out, where after this, everyone's going to hate me or that sort of thing. So you also want to make sure you set things up where you're not going to be run into a real pitfall or disaster. But otherwise, you can find that you can get tasks done a bit better, or maybe a lot better, if you again, don't try to swallow the whole thing. Don't set yourself up for failure. See, you're going to have an aversion response to anything in life where there's potential failure. And instead of just trying to overcome that directly through like willpower, which is another habitual thing people do, is instead of what I try to do is I try to change the game. by stepping outside of it in some way, breaking out. If there's a potential for failure in a particular quote unquote game or situation, or if there's a task where I have it framed in my mind where it can fail or succeed, but it's basically out of my control, or maybe I convince myself it's in my control if I'm just great enough or I have enough willpower, if I'm determined enough, but really that's false, where even if I'm determined, even if I have a lot of willpower, then I could still fail. So if you have a task where you want to sit down and work on ranking a website, but you feel, or if you want to like start making money online or have some kind of goal where it's out of your control in some way, then there's the possibility of failure, and that's going to cause you to have an aversion. You might also have the opposite of aversion. I'm blacking out on a good word for it, but you might also want to accomplish a task, but so then you're going to feel conflicted. And again, I like to I like to understand life in a certain way, and I basically do. But if I run into this on a individual task level, or a situation comes up where there's a struggle, then I try to look for a way out of it where I'm not just struggling with conflict. So if I have if I have an aversion to something that I also want, then you want to have a way to work through that. And I'm just giving you the answer in a sense, or one part of the answer that might kind of fully take care of it from you, depending on what other things are going on in your mind, particularly. There's a lot of potential wrong ideas we could have, but just by looking at a task differently, where you're seeking to build your understanding rather than seeking to get a particular result in a way that you could fail. You can know what the result is that you're going for, such as make a certain amount of money, or rank a website or whatever, but you use that just to organize what you're seeking understanding about. Just like if you're working on a math problem, then you understand what the goal of the math problem is, right? Like what answer you're trying to answer. But then you can approach it in a way where you're not setting yourself up for failure, because then in any particular few moments, what you're doing is just building on what you know, rather than feeling like something's wrong until you fill something into at least tentatively what the conclusion is or what the answer is. So that can give you a start, at least, or a useful idea that can be helpful with any of these things. I can go on and on and on, but let me think if there's anything major else. Oh, there's one other important thing it's something I wanted to talk about anyway, so this gives me a nice template to show it. All right. This is pretty useful and profound. It's sort of, I've talked about this before, but it's a different way of expressing it, so it might hit you in a particular way. And this is applicable to everything, not even just getting tasks done. Okay, I'm just thinking for a second. So I'm going to be talking about carrying scenarios through in your mind, but I have a note here. I just want to remember something. All right. There's a way that I wanted to point something out to you. Oh, I know what it was. Okay. Just like, let's start simple. Just like if you're looking at a computer screen of a computer game, and I've used the idea of like that. Let's say you're in the computer game, you're a guy running around with a gun in the forest, and you're shooting bad guys. Then you understand that whatever's not shown on your computer screen, it potentially can be processed and come up. Like if you move your guy somewhere else in that forest, then you'll see what's there. But nowhere in the world is the visualization of it, or the representation of it, or what's on your screen. It ends at your screen. There's nothing else further. There's the potential for it in the code to show other parts of that forest, but we can have kind of an approximation or a fantasy that can be useful, that whole forest exists within the computer game and it looks a certain way, but it only exists like as potential code. It doesn't look a certain way yet. The same thing is true in real life. And I'm going to go from here to one more step after that, but I'm just kind of leading us through this so we're all on the same page and we can picture this. In real life, when you look around visually, let's say, then we have this kind of fantasy model of the world where the world visually, or kind of in the sense of it being hard and real and made of stuff and material and everything, that it continues just as it looks like to us visually around the corner where we're not looking. But your visual experience of the world, the potential for it exists, but it stops at the edge of your own vision. Like there's no actual, there's a way that the physical world as you experience it, like your experience of the physical world, it ends at your experience. And it's only the potential for it at the outside. Now, that may or may not click with you, but I'm using that as just to kind of build a scenario or build a sequence for us to understand something else. We think that our mind, let's say our mind says you don't really feel, so to speak, you don't really feel like sitting down and doing this task right now. It's gonna, you feel like doing something else, right? We tend to imagine none of this is something we kind of imagine explicitly or fantasize or suppose explicitly, but we kind of operate on the idea that our mind has worked through that situation and come to the conclusion. We tend to think that it did so in a much more thorough and complete and scenario-based way than it really does. If you picture an actual brain the way we generally understand it, if someone has a thought, then there's neurons you might see lit up, right? And then the way neurons work is they are connected to some other neurons. And so the neurons that are kind of one step away from the cluster that's lit up might then light up next. And then that's about it. Like then there'll be a sequence of one thing lights up, the next thing lights up. But it fades pretty fast after the first, the stuff that's like one step removed. And so if your brain is telling you that you don't want to do a particular task very much, or that you'd rather do something else, or that you don't want to finish it after you start, like you start doing it and then you really feel like doing something else, there's normally just one justification or one sort of reason. It's not that your brain has thought through a sequenced complete scenario. It hasn't done that at all. That's never happened. And what that means is if you do that on purpose, or you lead it through that on purpose, or you refuse to move on, if you think of yourself as like the president and your brain is a bunch of advisors, which is not a perfect metaphor, but it's helpful. If you refuse until they walk through the scenarios with you, then it can really change things, because your brain will make connections that it wouldn't otherwise have made. Like you thought that it had gone through the reasoning, but it really had never done so. There was just kind of one association or one little script that it was working off of. And so let's say that you're thinking, all right, do I want to sit down on my computer and start working on ranking a website, which just might, so for starters, the fact that you're just going to start building your understanding will make it a lot easier. It might just break down the problem right there. But another thing you can do is you can say, all right, so if I do that, let's suppose I sit down and I start working on it, how am I going to feel as I continue? Well, and what am I going to accomplish? Well, I'm certainly going to build my understanding one way or the other of how to do things. Either I'm going to try and register the domain and I'm going to get confused, and then I realize that I don't know what to do yet, and so then I'm going to know to watch a video on it or ask a question on it, and then I'll get the answer, and then okay, then I'll do it, and then I'll continue on, and then I'll have it on WordPress, then I'll be looking at my website in the admin of WordPress, and I might wonder what to do. But then if you're poking around in the back of WordPress, it gives you a sense of what's going on there. And it'll be very different if I listen to Greg talk about what to do once I've poked around, once I have my website set up and I'm poking around in the back of WordPress. Then when Greg talks about posts and pages, and then it'll make more sense. And then let's suppose you just start trying to write an article, and then you make a link, and you don't even know where you want to link out to, but you're just trying to like physically create a link. Then you have more and more of templates and building a good way to building blocks in your brain, in your mind. And then again, when you're listening to Greg, it'll make more and more sense. So you literally, you can sit there, you can walk through how that's all going to work in your mind, and then you can continue on and you can see how, all right, well, then I'll probably wonder about how I get incoming links to my website, and then I'll maybe go and check out some videos on that, and I'll learn. Maybe I'll have some questions, and then it'll all start to make sense for me, and then I can rank a website. Once I rank one website for some keywords, then all bets are kind of off. Now I really see how it works, and I can see how I can scale that up, and I can do more. And then plus that's no longer going to be a black box for me or a worry, and then I can start to, so I've kind of broken through with that, and then I can stack on top of that, and I can start working on monetization. That's all maybe kind of exciting, and then that can lead to money, and then I might think, and then even then, if you don't feel motivated, even after all that, you can think, what do I want to spend my money on? Again, we think that our brain has this all worked out, but our brain has never done this whatsoever. It's never gone through all these steps. Same thing, you can be doing this with another person, where if you actually imagine that you're them, you imagine physically you're them, you look like them, you are them, you imagine part of what's going on in their life, and then you imagine interacting with you or a particular situation, then you'll understand people that you want to understand. You'll understand them way better. And we act as if, in a sense, we wouldn't necessarily affirm this explicitly, but we act as if our brain does that automatically, and it doesn't. Our brain has, like, until we walk through scenarios like that, then our brain never made those connections. And so our brain isn't some like oracle giving us this like brilliant advice. It's really someone who's just using a default mechanism of thinking that's just based on associations and scripts and approximations and so forth. And so with those two ideas, walk through the scenario all the way through. You'll find that you can connect up your motivation for things that are good for you in a way that's almost magical, very effective, just by walking through all the way through a scenario, and going all the way through to it working, getting the result, and then feeling great about enjoying the result. And you can also, if you want, you can contrast it to, what if I just kind of goof off and maybe I just do something that's not so productive. Maybe it kind of feels like it's productive, but really it isn't. Or maybe you have two tasks and you would think they both might be productive, and you can walk through where they both might lead. And often when you just walk through the scenario, then it becomes really obvious what the answer is. But before you did that, it wasn't obvious at all. So between that and the thing I said originally about not needing to know the answer before you start, instead sitting down and having your process be building understanding, then those two things can particularly help to unblock you. Okay, let's see. Wow, that's so nice. Someone wrote, just being live with you is totally making my day. Thanks again, Mr. Mills. All right. It is being recorded. How would you recommend using the LOI to overcome procrastination? Cool. I think I dealt with that as well. I think probably that was posted before I even got into this. Yeah, it was posted early on. So it's definitely, I know that's a very common question. And then there's always the, never do tomorrow what you can, never put off till tomorrow what you can put off until the day after tomorrow. By the way, let me tell you one more thing, since I had another question on this. Another way to help with procrastination is to distinguish, because sometimes in life it's actually helpful to what you might call strategically delay. And so since sometimes in life it actually is better to wait and give yourself more time, then that's going to cause a real issue if you don't distinguish when and why that might be versus times when it's better to do something right away. Since there can be a legitimate reason for putting something off, if you can't tell the difference, then that also is going to mess you up when it comes to procrastination. So let's talk about, so I'm glad there was a second question, even if it was similar. Let's talk about how to tell whether it's better to delay. What you want to tend to do is look and see whether, one of the ways to distinguish, or one very helpful thing, is looking to see whether time is on your side or whether it's sort of against you. In general, you want time to be on your side in life with most everything. But if you're, let's say, if you're trying to make an income with OMG, then time is on your side if you're building understanding with it. If you're doing anything that's increasing your understanding, then you're good. Time's on your side. So if you're procrastinating, gaining understanding, and then that's getting in your way. Now let's say also that you're just listening to videos but you're not trying to put things into practice, then the trouble is there is you're not having a feedback loop. You want to have a feedback loop between like getting in the game, like if you're playing football or something, you want to get on the field at least half the time, but then you also want to take time to reflect. If you spend all your time on the field, then that's actually not very helpful. But then if you, of course, spend all your time reflecting and watching videos, then that's not going to be helpful either. So what you specifically want is a feedback loop. Setting your brain up to have a good feedback loop is good. Your brain thrives off of that, and what you're trying to do as part of law of implication is you're trying to create an engine or a context and situation that will allow your brain to as it functions, to allow it to do what it does best, essentially. Just like I do with people that I work with, I try to put them in a place where the way that they naturally operate by default, their natural existing current talents, and plus what they enjoy, what might burn them out, what won't burn them out. As I understand that, then I put them in a position to thrive as best as I can. But because I focus on it, I do a fairly good job with it. Same thing with your brain. You want to put it in a position to thrive, and so you want to put it in a position where if you wanted to improve a skill for yourself or your brain, then make sure there's a feedback loop going on. So if there's no feedback loop, then time is not on your side because the engine isn't functioning efficiently. Let's say that, all right, we started at OMG, I think it was 2012, it was about 3 years ago, in about September. We closed out our first lead generation product at the end of December. At that point, we didn't exactly have a plan. I didn't have a plan to get new leads coming in. I didn't exactly know how we would do that. However, time was on our side in a whole number of ways. If I just looked at the income coming in, there were probably a couple months where it was less than when we were like in full-on launch mode. So in that way, it could look like there's a trend downward. But you want to be very careful about when you see a trend in life when there isn't really a trend going on. Sometimes there's an overall, the train is going one way, but then it can get off the tracks. It's very different than if the default is that it's just degrading. But time was on our side in a whole number of ways. Greg was doing research. We were building out sites that we could use as examples. People that were already in our program were developing and on the way to having success. I was developing more ways we're developing a new front-end product at that time. We don't anymore have a front-end product, but we were developing one to get leads. So in the one hand, perhaps our income was dipping down, and current now, it's way past that, and it's mostly gone up over the years. But time was on our side in a number of ways, so I wasn't sitting there in a panic to, oh my gosh, we need to get leads right away, or we need to make something happen right away. Things were getting built, and that's fine. So time was on my side, so I wasn't feeling like we were procrastinating with something. So there's plenty of times in your life where time is on your side, particularly also if you pay attention to building your life so it's on your side, then that's helpful. With your finances, if you have a way to live on less money than you're making, then time is on your side income-wise, however you're making it, even if it's at a job, then time is on your side. So that's helpful. And then you can just gain understanding. Particularly, you want to work on do things right away when time is against you. Like you can see this with doing dishes. There's a way that even years ago I came up with this illustration, even when I was teaching accelerated learning. And after I gave this example I'm about to give, then the girl said to me during class, she said, not only is this helping me to not procrastinate with my learning, but I'm also doing my dishes right away. The thing with dishes is that if you let them sit, then the crap on them tends to harden, right? And it's just harder later. And so it's just literally easier to do dishes right after they first are made dirty than to do them later, unless you need to soak them, in which case it's more efficient to soak them. But the point is that there's things in life that you're better off just doing it now. And if there's no reason not to do it now, and And also another way that time might be against your side is if it's going to be going through your head. Sometimes there's kind of unimportant tasks that I'm going to naturally feel motivated right before the deadline, and I'm going to have no problem doing it right before the deadline. Sometimes you might need a day in advance. You might do it even a day in advance. If there's any chance that if your car could break down or something could go wrong, then at least do it a day in advance. But I'll feel motivated to do it. This happens also with shopping. Sometimes when we're procrastinating, it's only relative to someone else, like our mom or spouse or someone, thinking that we should do something sooner. And I in no way, because my wife doesn't do this to me that I can remember. But I'm just saying theoretically it could be the case. So look out for that. But I was mentioning about shopping, where I generally shop for food when I'm hungry. Now the drawback is you end up buying a bunch of stuff, but which might cause you to overeat. So if that could be a separate problem, but I'm not dealing with that right now. Let's put that aside, stipulate that away. And but I just naturally will enjoy shopping for groceries when I'm hungry because I want the groceries, right? And if I shop when I'm not hungry, then it's not as enjoyable, right? So I go shop when I want something. If it's going to be like that, then just wait until you want it. You see, if you kind of just picture the scenario clearly, then it should resolve itself where you can say, oh, okay, yeah. Then just do it that way. However, another thing that can come up is where you're going to have to do something and it's going to keep going through your head until you do it, causing an open loop for you. If that's the case, then do it right away because time's against you, because the longer you put it off, the more you have this kind of inefficient loop open in your head. So anything that's kind of bugging you, then you can think it through and make sure it's bugging you for a reason. But if you have to do it, you have to keep reminding yourself you have to do it, then do it now because time's against you. So that time is on your side, time is not on your side. When it comes to groceries, there's not going to be a problem. There's not really, another thing is if there's a danger that it's really going to cause a disaster, and if there could be any problem doing it at the last minute, then do it as soon as possible, right? When it comes, at the end of every month, I pay affiliates. And if I didn't pay affiliates, that could be a real problem. And so I basically pay them like the minute after midnight, so to speak, because that's when I don't have the data until then from my shopping cart program. But I do it right away because just in case any weird thing goes wrong or my internet breaks, right? Like sometimes internet goes down just randomly for part of the day, just wherever you might live. Of course, I can go somewhere, travel somewhere that has a hotspot or use my phone or something. But things can come up, and it wouldn't like fully destroy OMG if I didn't pay affiliates on the day that I say, but it's pretty great not to have like broken windows, right? To have that be the case. And I've done that successfully the whole way through, and it's certainly appreciated. It gets us some mileage. And so again, I do it immediately when I can because disaster could be a problem. So you want to look at is time on my side or against me? And also could it really be a disaster, in which case you probably want to do it as soon as you possibly can. Because that'll give you the max amount of time to avoid a total disaster. And I mean like a real disaster that'll particularly hurt you. Okay, let's go on here. And I realize that on this webinar, I'm not really doing a lot of conversations back and forth with people. I think I will get to that point. I figure that I'll get used to doing things. I'll get started here, but however this webinar is not necessarily a trend for the future. And I'll be looking based on being more comfortable, although I feel very comfortable right now, but I'll kind of add features and take risks as I go on. And that's the normal way that I say to do things, right? You kind of stack, you build understanding. I don't try to swallow everything at once. If it was going to be really important for me to, anything critical, if it was critical for me to have a back and forth audio in an audio way with people where I brought them on, then I would do that, but it's not critical. And so I figure I'll start this way. And then even as early as next webinar, maybe I'll have a verbal back and forth with people, or at least have more of even a text-based back and forth. Let's see here. Thank you. Someone wrote, and I'm not using names, I'm happy to use them, but otherwise I just don't put people on the spot or whatever. I'm new to OMG and found that by listening to your Law of Implication series, it truly gave me a new perspective and a better place to start, not by checking boxes, but by creating goals. That's excellent. I'm so glad that it's helping you. And let me tell you real quick, I have a little bit of a quandary as I'm trying to help people with Law of Implication, in that I want to give you things that you can use right away. But by its nature, if you picture those Russian Matryoshka dolls again, where there's like one inside the other, or if you imagine that you're getting outside of a game in order to rig it, to change it if the game is rigged where you might fail, then I can give you stuff that'll work within your current worldview, or that's likely to work within most everyone's current worldview, that sort of thing. And I do that because if I don't do that, first of all, that'll help you right away, which I want, and then plus it'll keep you interested. The risk is I don't want you to get stuck there. One thing I've talked about in one of my series is a local peak idea. And I just want to give I don't want to get stuck on this for too long, but let's actually invert it. It might be particularly easy to picture. If you imagine water running down a hill, but if there is natural little basins along the hillside, then some of the water can get stuck in a local basin and it won't get all the way to the bottom, right? And the local peak idea is the same. It's just a different way of illustrating it. If you have a little robot and you want to program it with an algorithm, if you have a mountain range or a range of hills or a range of peaks, and you want to try to program a robot to get to the highest possible spot, right? And the robot can't like see, or if it's a person doing this, but if you imagine it's all foggy and you can't see very far, then you would follow a heuristic. And there's really not much you could do because unless you had a way of knowing you were not on the highest peak, then you would get stuck on whatever local peak you were on because the algorithm would have to look something like you take a step, and if it takes you higher, then you keep going in that direction. But if it takes you lower, then you kind of turn around randomly, and then what that algorithm will get you to the top of the peak that you're on. And there actually isn't really a way to write an algorithm that I'm aware of that'll guarantee you to get on the top of the highest peak. You would separately need a way for the robot to know that it was not on the highest peak. And then it could actually work if you programmed in advance that the highest peak is 5,000 feet. Once you can't climb anymore, if like every direction is taking you down, then if every direction is taking you down, then and if you're not at 5,000 feet, then you basically kind of like teleport randomly. You just kind of run randomly for a while in one direction to kind of get you on another random peak. And that would work where eventually the robot would get to the highest peak, right? But the only way I'm aware of to make that work is for the robot to have some way to know, or a person where there's fog on a mountain range, to have some way to know that they're not on the highest peak. We actually do have that in life, which is the really, really cool thing. Is that if there's any bad that you're experiencing yourself, or if someone else is clearly experiencing bad and you don't know how to help them, then you're not done seeking understanding, and you want to keep on digging, and you need to get outside of the game you're playing. If there's sort of like an inevitable possibility of bad within the worldview or the way that you see life, if you have rules or scripts or times when you're like, well, if this happens, then I'm going to feel bad. And I should feel bad in that case. If that's going on in your brain, you're not done. You need to figure out there's a contradiction there somewhere, I guarantee you. But what I was saying in response to this person was be careful and don't get stuck on this like local peak where I give you something useful and you're like, that's awesome. That's what LOI is. And now I have what I need. And then, of course, you can do other stuff in your life, but don't give up fully on LOI at that point, or don't feel satisfied until life is perfect for yourself and everybody else. You want to keep on digging and working to build your understanding. So it's a quandary for me when I'm teaching stuff. I want to give people an indication of the deepest ideas, but at the same time, I don't want to blow people out at the beginning. And so I also want to give people stuff that can be useful right off the bat. So I try to do both. Let's see here. I like to read these first before I read them out loud, just in case. Let me just skip down for a second. I'll come back to some of the questions, but let me just take a whack at this. I actually don't have any idea of the answer as I start, as usual, but I'll use my usual process of just starting to get a foothold of what I know. The statement is, how can LOI help those overcoming emotional or mental trauma? Okay. people that have had a traumatic event and it's still causing them problems, then what they have is a belief that they should feel bad about the event, right? They feel like it's necessary for some reason. And as long as they have that belief, then they tend to be stuck no matter what you say or however else you try to help them. And one of the deepest ideas of law of implication is coming to understand the idea that it's a contradiction in terms that you ever should feel bad. Now, the word should culturally can have different meanings. There's a should based on a sort of authority or culture, where, you know how I talked about working through the scenarios earlier, where if you continue through a scenario, you can reach some surprising conclusions that in retrospect should have always been obvious, but only if you work through the scenarios. And we thought that our brain was maybe doing that, but it never happened. If you work through the scenario that you should do, there's a whole bunch of things that you probably think that you should do, should believe, should feel, including times when you should feel bad or should feel guilty or should feel angry in a way that is hurtful to even you when you feel angry. Then if you take a look at what should means, it doesn't really continue anywhere. Like you start and you're like, well, people say that I should feel bad in this case, and basically an authority figure made you feel like you should do a certain thing. Remember, there was a time in history when people felt like being left-handed was something that they should not be, and that they were evil or cursed by the devil or something like that. So the chain of reasoning, if a person, now it's not that someone's going to stick with you on this. Of course, a person has to have a commitment. The ultimate key to the locked door with LOI, when you're dealing with someone trying to overcome trauma like this, you're generally not going to be able to give them a template. Generally, like an easy fix, the fix is the deepest idea of law of implication. Unless you get to the bottom of the law of implication, ideas like you are not your brain, or that it's never the case that you should feel bad. And then I'm going to give one other characterization of it, which I believe I talked about in the most recent Q&A video I released just a day or so ago. If there's anything where you want it to be true, but it's of the nature where it already either is true or not. So something like that you should feel bad about something, it's already the case that you should feel bad about a particular event or not. It's not like a future goal. There could be a different future goal, which would be to feel okay about the whole thing or to work through the trauma. But in terms of whether the statement, I should feel bad about being hurt in whatever way, that it's either true or false right now, whether you currently should feel bad about it. Regarding that or anything else in life, if you want to believe something is true, including about, say, God, the lock that keeps people locked out of understanding that God exists, the proof is not very, very difficult. It just has to do with understanding causation and understanding infinity. But the lock on it is that people want to believe either that God exists, or they don't, or they want to believe it's not important, or they want to believe that God doesn't exist, or they want to believe something like, come on, it would already be figured out by now. It doesn't make any sense that we would have reached this point in 2015 and nobody knows, and then one random dude figured it out, right, and is claiming to. So all of that kind of doesn't fit in people's model for the world. The idea of knowing with absolute clarity that God exists, it doesn't fit, which is another deep idea about how by default thinking, what people are trying to do. The idea of understanding, the concept itself of understanding is twisted by people by accident, by your mind, to mean fitting in to a model of the world. People feel like they understand something if they can fit the concept, so they have to kind of massage or force or smush or break or twist concepts, especially ones that I talk about that are kind of deep, because they don't fit at all. They cannot fit within people's model of the world. They're outside of anyone's model. which is good because they can change the game in a way that is typically not thought possible. But the problem is that when I say the word understand, people, because of their existing model of the world, they immediately twist that by accident without realizing it to mean fitting. And so they're like, okay, so how do I fit LOI in with my model of the world? And they can kind of a little bit adjust their model, a little bit adjust what they think I mean. But as long as it has to fit, then it's not going to happen. We need to have a different idea. We want to break our model of the world and rebuild it. Let me see where I was here. Okay, so in order to help someone with emotional trauma, you and then they are going to need to work through the deepest ideas. The deepest ideas are not necessarily complicated, but because they don't fit at all within people's worldview, people have to be willing to break their worldview. And if someone wants to believe anything that is logically related to the idea that they are not willing to break their worldview, if you want to believe something, it means you want to keep things fitting in with your existing model of the world. It's also related to a feeling of control. People, we don't control a lot of the world. What we can do is rig things so that whatever luck and randomness there is, it's rigged properly. For example, when I use the illustration of receptors on the outside of a cell and then randomly hormones traveling through the bloodstream, you can't do anything about the randomness of the hormones bouncing around. What you'd want to do is have the receptor just that'll only fit the right messenger, the right hormone or whatever else you want it to fit in the randomness of the bloodstream. People want to feel a sense of control in their lives, and they feel like if they break their model of the world, that they'll lose control. They start to examine ideas that they already have fit into their understanding of the world, they will feel a loss of control. And that's correct. See, that's the same as that local peak issue. The thing about the local peak illustration is it shows how if you're on one peak, let's say the highest peak is 5,000 feet. If you're on a peak and it's only 2,000 feet, then the only way to get from the 2,000 foot top of that peak to the real highest peak, which I've stipulated is 5,000, is to go through a valley where you're actually doing something that looks like negative progress, looks like you're going backwards, but you're not. If you could see the highest peak and you walk straight to it, you would be walking downhill, which in this illustration you don't want to do, right? You're trying to get to the highest level you can. It looks like you're making negative progress, but you're not. If you could see properly, you'd just be going straight to the highest peak the whole time. So if you break your existing worldview, if you're willing to do that, if you're willing to drop all goals to believe that anything is true, no matter how important it is to you, including that you're a good person or you're intelligent or anything like that, so being willing to do that, it'll feel like negative progress according to our normal model. But you and then the other person that you're trying to help or yourself, if you're trying to help yourself, you need to be willing to break your existing model. You can't win. You're rigged for failure within the general way that people understand the world. Then there's all these times when it's necessary that you should feel bad. But you need to break out of that. One thing that can start though to help is just walking through scenarios. If a person is willing to, or if you're just do it for yourself and you're willing to, then so let's say someone walked up and punched me in the face and gave me a black eye. I realize that a lot of trauma comes from some sort of sexual molestation, but that can make people feel kind of not nice or uncomfortable. So let's just say I'll just use something where someone gives me a black eye, punches me. Then suppose I sit around feeling bad about that for the next 20 years. What if I walk through that scenario of how that, and then let's suppose that I remember I want to be happy. I don't just want to fit the world to give myself an illusion of control. I don't just want to achieve the goals that are currently in my mind. My deepest idea is I want to be happy, and including I want others to be happy as well. So if that's the case, is that really the most effective strategy to sit around and spend half an hour a day being upset? Maybe we can cut that down. This is kind of funny, right? You can say, well, how about instead of spending a half an hour a day being upset, about the fact a person punched me in the face. Maybe I do it only 15 minutes a day, right? Maybe some days I put it off altogether, right? Maybe I have like a designated time each week where for 3 hours I just get really, really, really angry about this person who punched me in the face. You know, for me, being taxed is very traumatic. I don't see any civic duty to have it happen. I don't see any benefit. I just see evil people pocketing the money is the way I look at it. And they even reinvest the money in weaponry to continue what they do, or bribing people one way or the other. So it's very traumatic to me. If I could choose between if they had a government office you can go into to be raped once a month or even every day versus like physically, literally. And in this case, I have no other, I can't think of any other way to put this, then I would at least try that out as opposed to being taxed. So literally, it's potentially worse to me than actually being raped. So it's traumatic. And it's that way for a lot of people. It's generally not talked about, but even psychiatrists will tell you that for many people, being taxed they feel like helpless. And I think particularly for men, it feels that way, but I'm sure plenty of women don't like being taxed either, or it's particularly traumatic. So for me, that's very traumatic. But I don't, there's a way in which feeling upset about it isn't going to get me anywhere. Instead, I can seek understanding of how to change. Either I let it go because I decide I'm not going to fight that battle, which I'm right now. I'm not like actively. Well, I'm actively fighting in the sense of trying to spread the correct way of thinking. When people think clearly and correctly, they would never think that extortion is good, right? If you got a letter from the mafia saying you give us $50,000 next week, or we're going to break your legs and we're going to start charging you interest, then you would be upset about that. You would feel like that's evil. And so if people can understand extortion isn't just evil, then that's my way of fighting it. But I'm not fighting it some other way. So I kind of pick my battles. I think, am I going to actively? So here's a couple of the steps that a person who has trauma can follow. Am I going to actively fight this battle? Am I going to try to change it in the world? You may or may not. And it's totally valid to pick some other battle right now. Maybe there's more important, more efficient things you're going to work on, some other problems that are more likely to help your life. If the same person didn't have much money, maybe better for them to work on creating something of value and just making money rather than dwelling on the trauma. Well, no matter what, you don't want to dwell on the trauma. So the only real question, right, is there's clearly no benefit at all, right? Once you start illustrating that if it's going to be half an hour a day, how about making it 15 minutes, right? Very quickly, you can show that there's no benefit in the actual trauma. The only benefit would be if you feel like that motivates you to change the world or to attempt to change the world so that you make whatever caused that trauma less in the world for yourself or for other people. And then you want to think of that now strategically. You don't need to be motivated by feeling upset. You can always motivate yourself in a different way than feeling upset. You can work through scenarios of what it would be like if you solved that problem and see how the world would be better, how you'd have more good and how other people would have more good. So you don't need to motivate yourself by being upset ever, personally. I understand that getting angry, appearing angry can in a sense motivate somebody else. Although still you're playing a game, there's a way to rig the game even better, where if you motivate someone with any kind of behaviorism, then there's essentially a pushback, and you're basically getting them to operate differently than their default. All right, the idea of default is such a critically important idea. It should be at the front of your thinking constantly, or else there's a major piece missing in your ability to think effectively. So default means like if you have a train and it's going on tracks in a particular direction, or if you have a car and it has momentum in a particular direction, or a person at any one point in their lives, you take any person, and right now for yourself, for me, for others, there's a current configuration of their goals and of what they tend to enjoy in life and so forth. Unless something acts in it to change it, the default is what's going to happen. The world is not still in so many ways, right? The world is in motion in various ways, including people and their personalities. And let me just make sure I'm not losing any train of thought here. I was talking about default with behavior. I was talking about behaviorism. I was talking about in the context of getting angry. So If you get angry at someone and that causes them to change their behavior off of their default, then it doesn't change their default itself. Typically, it'll, in a lot of cases, in most every case with a behaviorism where you're rewarding or punishing someone in order to get a behavior from them, then all you're doing is like temporarily getting the train off the tracks, but then it'll go back on the tracks as soon as you stop with the behaviorism. And you want to be aware in life when you're doing that, because that has the effect that it has. It might be behaviorism at certain times. It might get you an effect that's good enough in that case. You still may never need to use it. I'm not actually putting my stamp of approval or disapproval on it, but I'm just talking for a moment in a vacuum, strategically, just so I don't talk about 20 different topics all at the same time. So even in terms of getting a result, the only time you would really want to use behaviorism is with someone you're not going to see again. Because if it's a repeated result that you want from someone that you're going to be around a lot, then you don't want to just be constantly struggling against their default. You either don't want to fight that battle at all and accept their default, or you basically want to accept their default regardless, or else get away from the person. Or you separately can be working on changing the way the tracks are, not just trying to push the train off the tracks temporarily, and so it goes back on. The train and the tracks there's a little deficiency, by the way, in that metaphor. I want to think of, I'm not thinking one at the moment, but if you can think of one for yourself, or stipulate inside of that metaphor where the train basically will operate to get back on those tracks. Actually, with a person, you can see this pretty easily. If you use punishment or getting angry or even rewards to get something from somebody, then you're not really changing their basic preferences. If anything, there's experiments that show that you're changing their default to make them even less want to do what you're rewarding or punishing them about. So back to getting angry and the idea of the trauma, you generally don't need to motivate. And so for sure with yourself, you're with yourself permanently, at least for the duration of how long yourself is going to be alive. Right? I'm not. Whatever happens after that is separate, but you're with yourself long term, we can say. So you do not want to use behaviorism, or you do not want to buy into the idea that your brain has to give you pain for anything, except for maybe as a quick signal that, hey, wait, something's off here. But you don't need to get angry to motivate yourself ever. All that's going to do is shift your default even farther from where you want it. If you want your default going in the right direction, you work through scenarios and you connect it up, how you think you want to behave, or the task you think you want to do, or the thoughts you want to focus on, or how you want to feel, connect it up to I was going to say the future, and that's kind of vague. But if you're getting angry at yourself because you don't want to, maybe a person who had trauma gets angry at themselves because they think maybe they attracted this into their lives. They did something to invite it or to permit it. Then you can work through the scenario. Okay, so do I need to get angry at myself for attracting it? No. If I don't want to attract, if I might have attracted, you don't know for sure. You might have just gotten particularly bad luck. Property rights violations are not necessarily attracted to you by what you did. But if there is something that you did to attract it or permit it, then you can work through it in your mind. You just want to seek understanding about it. You can feel plenty motivated if you imagine seeking understanding about it, figuring out how it is that you're attracting, or at least letting it into your life and not filtering it out, and then getting rid of it. That's what I mean by just walking through the scenario, seeing how that's going to get rid of the issue. And so then just seek understanding. Where in that scenario am I going to help it by getting upset at myself? Nowhere. Right? It's just going to be a distraction. And plus it's unpleasant on top of that. So it's less efficient, less happy, which is common. And something that's less efficient is typically less pleasant, and vice versa. So you don't need the anger. If you think that you had something to do with it, don't need to feel guilty, don't need to be ashamed. There's just, if there's a wrong idea, then you'll figure that wrong idea out by seeking understanding. That's all you need to do. Seeking understanding is already what you want to be doing in general in life. The only question is, what's the importance? Where are you going to get the most bang for your buck out of what you're seeking understanding for? Every day you want to be, seeking understanding as best you can. So don't need anger for that. Separately, whether you want to focus on dealing with the cause of this trauma, like in this case, taxation or some people punching each other in the face. There's that punching game or whatever people had, and or whatever else. Then you can decide, is that the battle you want to work on? It may be, and it may not be. But look over your life as a whole and get it, briefly, but or take a while, whatever, and then just decide which battle you want to fight. If I'm going to be working on making a shift, changing the default of other people, of the world, of myself, I want to be focused on it. So I don't want to do a drive-by. I don't want to have one toe in. I don't want to be fighting a battle. I don't pride myself on winning this battle and winning that battle. And anytime someone challenges me, I can beat them because I'm so smart. I'm not gonna really do a struggle unless I'm gonna be willing to focus on it. And if I am struggling, I'm struggling to understand how to rig the game from outside of it, typically, unless the game is rigged for success. The wonderful thing is existence as a whole is rigged for success. It's inevitably can be successful. Nothing can stop you. But individual circumstances in the world right now are often rigged for failure. And so you need to step outside of your model of those things. And how do you do that? You do that by focusing on what you can know, not wanting to believe a certain thing to be true. And if there's something bad still there, you keep zooming in on it, keep trying to look at it from different angles and develop scenarios about it until you spot the place where there is a contradiction. Okay, that's all I'll say about that for now. Ha 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 ha, thank you, I appreciate that. Dave Keys writes, you're doing great. You can practice webinars with me anytime. Although that was a long time ago, I might not be doing great since then. Someone wrote, I can't hear you now, but I presume that's someone else's. Yeah, I'm sure more people will be telling me if there was a problem with that. Hopefully that isn't a problem. I'm looking at some of these questions. It's not that I want to filter them or not, but I just want to see. Ideally, and I'll try to save a lot of these. I'll definitely try to look to make sure I save these before the end. Well, thank you. Still doing great. I appreciate that, Dave. Okay. Someone wrote that they can, I'm paraphrasing, but that they can some days, well, they say sometimes I feel like literally like breaking my laptop or something because I want to be successful and rich and it's not happening yet. Right. That is an example of setting yourself up for failure in the sense of wanting to see a result. It's interesting to note, even experientially, I can tell you that if someone comes into OMG and they say, what I want is I just want to see it working once. I want to see one transaction where I make money online. I want to see it happening. That is very understandable, but that's exactly what I said ultimately you shouldn't do. It's totally understandable people do it because I also said it's what everyone does. No, I don't mean that specific thought, but the idea that they want to start with a conclusion. You start with, when you have a goal, the goal, you shouldn't feel a sense of forward motion towards it in a way that you feel frustrated on the way to it. Instead, again, if you picture, hold on, let me drink water for a second. Okay, and the person also said, and they're concerned about seeing results. This is why I know that it takes a while because at first most everything I say is going to get twisted to fit in the worldview that people have. The way that you want to move forward towards a goal is by building understanding. Building understanding cannot be stopped. There cannot be an obstacle put in the way of it. You see, the traditional way of looking at goals, people don't realize they look at goals this way, but they have a deep way of looking at it that where it's like there's a place there's one of two ways that amount to the same thing. There's either a place and they're like a physical person and they're trying to physically get from where they are to that place, and that metaphorically in a sense, where at the place they're trying to get to is a bunch of money, all right, for example. Or it might not be exactly like that, but you have the same, it amounts to the same thing in distance, but it's through time, where they imagine in the future, they imagine a future scenario where they have, it's more like a highlight reel than a scenario, but where they have money and they want it. That's their goal. And they're traveling kind of through time, so to speak, or they have to perform a bunch of actions, but in a sense, but it's very similar in terms of distance. And then once you are operating within that model, you need standards and norms and expectations to set off of. And those are arbitrary. Arbitrary means there's a reason, but the reasons terminate at nothing. Like like if someone says, there's so many examples that I'm having trouble for a moment coming up with something arbitrary. Being a PhD is arbitrary in the sense that the reason why someone's a PhD is a group of PhDs approved them to be a PhD. And then if you keep looking back, then at some point there was the first guy who just basically declared himself a PhD, right? Or some other group of some group of people just declared that this first guy or this first group of people is PhD, some king or something. So ultimately it's arbitrary, you see, because as you iterate backwards, it terminates into something where there's no real basis. Okay, so people's expectations are constantly arbitrary. They have a reason, just like there's a reason why someone's a PhD. It's because other people told them that they were, like they got approved by existing PhDs, and those existing PhDs got approved by previous PhDs. But the reasons don't ultimately lead anywhere if you keep on asking, well, why is that? So this person would have an arbitrary expectation of how hard it should be to become rich. And for sure, anyone that's ever frustrated with OMG doesn't even, they must believe that the path to becoming a doctor is extraordinarily inefficient, despite the fact that there's a widespread belief in the world that it's a very efficient and effective way and a respected way to make money. You should go to school for about 11 years, and you can't even just choose to do that you'd better do so well in school for the first 4 years that you have to get into med school. Once you get into med school, it's kind of easy from there. It's a lot of work, but it's not nearly as hard as getting in. And then you might make, I don't know, somewhere between 150 and 250 a year, unless you do research, in which case apparently it's like 30,000 or something per year. So, but presumably people don't have that in mind with OMG. Presumably they have less than 11 years. Usually it's only a few months in their head, but that in and of itself is arbitrary. What you want to understand is that when you're in OMG, the game is rigged in your favor hugely, and that's about all I can do for you. I could always do more in a sense, but in terms of the general design of it, it's really rigged in your favor. So you're playing in a game that it's rigged to win. So all you need to do from there is just basically put one foot in front of the other, but where instead of trying to get results, you keep building understanding. Stop measuring feedback in terms of results. That's not the type of feedback I'm talking about. Feedback is like, I go and at least I try to rank a site rather than just keeping watching videos. And then I get a sense of where that took me. But I'm not like looking to see whether I failed or not. You see, as long as there's a possibility of failure within your model for achieving a goal, you've done it wrong. And the person who's going to show you how to do it right is me. And so hear what I just said and go through my other training about goals, and I'll continue with live webinars and so forth. But it took me so many years. You don't know how many hundreds of hours I've probably put into thinking about how to understand goals properly. And I've tried, I would get closer and closer, but it wouldn't be quite right. These days I understand it pretty well. I still think about it and work on it. But it's how we interact with goals. If I were to go through these questions, they're all going to, so not all, but a majority of them, or at least a lot of them, are going to be some form of the question, how do I most effectively go after goals? Because it's so fundamental to our experience in life. And it's a great question. It's an excellent question. That's why I've spent so long on it. But the way that you typically, by default, the way everyone, no matter if you're a Republican or Democrat or what country you're from or whatever, this basic way of looking at goals is universal. And it's rigged for failure. The game is rigged against you. As soon as you look at goals that way, you're going to feel angry. You're going to feel frustrated. Sometimes you're going to feel triumphant, but you're going to predictably feel all sorts of bad feelings. And it's also very inefficient because, again, when I talk about these two different types of people doing math problems, the one that does it effectively and the one that panics, and the one that does it effectively just works on building on what they know without they're not like halfway through the process. They're not like, I just got to see the result. I just got to see that answer and then I'll continue. No, of course, if someone's halfway through working out an effective math problem person is halfway through working through a math problem, it looks like halfway through getting a haircut, right? Imagine if you tell a hair, this is a kind of a great illustration, right? If you tell the person cutting your hair, halfway through cutting my hair, I just want to see it look great. And I at least want it to look better than it does coming in. If it doesn't, then that's a real problem, and I'm going to really get upset and storm out of here. That illustrates the exact concept of an OMGer who is trying to get results, and they're saying halfway through that they need to be getting better results than they got coming in. After a little while, you might have spent some money, at least $1 on hosting, and maybe you got some software like OMG Command Center, like $50 a month. All of that matters to me, that's money, and I like it to be as little as possible. No one has to spend any money other than the fee. There's plenty of ways to work at it if you have nothing. But you might even be backwards. You might even look like you're making negative progress because you're spending money. Just like if you're getting your hair cut, right? Halfway through, it's going to look worse than when you started. But they just keep on going, and it's rigged for you to succeed. Video games are this way. They're rigged for you to succeed ultimately, right? Video games are made so that you can finish them. If you were in the actual real life situation, same with a movie. You watch a movie and you expect the guy to just keep on plugging forward, right? Keep on putting one foot in front of the other, the hero or the protagonist, because at least in any kind of heroic or action movie, maybe in some of these psychodramas, there's a bad ending or whatever. But in the type of movie I'm talking about, or a book, right? Same type of thing. It's rigged for them to succeed in essence, and so they just need to keep on going. If those were real life people, they wouldn't know it was rigged, and they would operate differently. People stick with video games; they do great. They just keep on building understanding until they finish it, right? I don't mean everyone all the time, but in plenty of people, the way they approach video games is a really effective way. And if they approached making money that way, it would be great. If they assume it's rigged in their favor, and they just need to keep on making progress in terms of building understanding. So that gives at least some more indication of what can be helpful there if anyone's getting frustrated. I can't tell you how, if you just make that one switch, for example, where you approach goals in terms of your feedback and your progress is based on building more that you know and more understanding, then you'll be so effective separate from all the other deep stuff in OMG, in LOI. Because just like with people that do math problems that way, that's all they do differently, and it's just they can solve them. So understanding and one foot in front of the other, yes, absolutely. I'm telling you, OMG, it's so rigged in your favor. It's unbelievable. And practically speaking, SEO is so wide open. There's so much opportunity with it that nothing's going on right now whatsoever where there's any kind of saturation in the least. So this is one of those crazy times you can just kind of follow the template. And it's not like there's an exact step-by-step because you have to figure out a little bit of where you add value in a sense. But it's right now with SEO and SEO consulting and same thing with the scanning on Amazon with the retail arbitrage. It just so happens to be so wide open right now that you can pretty much just follow the steps. But you can let go of the result. You only need to know what result you want in order to know what you're building understanding towards, and not for any other reason. Don't look at results as feedback. Feedback is whether you're gaining an understanding. What you want to do in life is rig it so that you cannot be stopped in doing. This is what I'm about to say is pretty cool. I suspected this, or I kind of proved that the opposite had to be false, that there had to be something that we, as whoever we are, ultimately as a person or as a being or whatever, there's something that we have to be able to do where no one can stop us from doing it. And it isn't like directly affecting the external world, right? It's not like we're like an all-powerful magician that could just do this or that. But there had to be something So there's all sorts of stuff we obviously don't have control over and that we can be stopped on and that obstacles can come up. But there had to be something that we actually did. One of the many, many drawbacks to getting our identity wrong. And by the way, in success literature, they correctly realize in various places, such as in Psychocybernetics is one of the iconic places that really harped on this, but it's in many places, where it's certainly contained within the law of attraction teaching and so forth, that your identity, your self-image, and so forth, the quality of your focus, what you're focusing on, from that flows your results in life. By the way, that's not exactly exact because there's also luck. But the range of approximation, it's like rigging a roulette table. The more you rig it, there's still like you still like have the randomness of the little roulette, whatever, I don't know what the game piece is called, but you know what I mean, the counter or whatever it is, the ball. There's still randomness in life. But anyhow, so your self-image definitely narrows down the range and kind of rigs the game in favor of good results. So let me just make sure I remember what I was saying here, or remember the thread. Your identity. Okay. The place that LOI will help make that better and stronger, and you're able to take advantage of that, is that so people get their identity wrong. And one thing that's going on in success literature currently and training is they don't quite realize that they're not their self. People, what they do is they conceptually split off part of themselves and call it something like their true self or whatever. And there's lots of different names or different perspectives or ways of approaching that. But they're still not stepping outside of their general identity as a person, as a physical person. And once you identify yourself with yourself, once you identify you as a being with yourself, the game is sort of rigged, is basically rigged against you. Because yourself, your brain, your body, can be stopped in all sorts of ways. And so when we think that that's who we are, then we take for granted that we can be stopped. And so it never occurs to people that there's something that you can do potentially that you can't be stopped, that it's power you have. And since what you want in life is to have more goodness, then that power would have to be something that is related to having more goodness, right? There's no other possible use of your power ultimately rather than to have more goodness in your life, right? So there's something that what I realized was there had to be something that you can do that once you identify properly who you are, then if you identify what it is you can do that you can't be stopped, then you could just keep doing that and you can keep on rigging the game stronger and stronger to get more goodness. And so first I realized that the opposite had to be false, that it couldn't be the case that we had no power. See, I don't know how well I'll be able to explain this right now, but it's like a contradiction in terms to say we have power, but then that power can be stopped at any moment. Like there has to be some leverage point that we actually do, that it has to be several steps removed from what we actually do, that's based on leverage, and that leverage can be attacked and that leverage can be stopped. Like we leverage what we do, ourself, our brain, our body carries out a lot of stuff and does a lot of stuff. But and then the first thing I realized a while ago, and I've said this many times, so this in and of itself is not a surprise, but that it's hard to characterize it perfectly with words, and I try to get better and better at building the scenario around it so you can see it. But something to do with seeking understanding of what's good, true, and important. Another way that I put it is you need to not accept, in an ultimate sort of way, bad stuff. And sometimes you don't know the answer. When I say that taxation is evil, then all we need to do is see that extortion is wrong in a vacuum, and also that government workers are arbitrary. They're just like the PhDs. If you look back at how government got started, if you imagine you're on an island with 10 people, and at first there's no government, and then there's a certain morality, right? There's certain things that are obviously wrong, like enslaving someone else, hurting someone else's body, taking any of their property. If 6 of the people just go and decide to form a government, that doesn't give them a special moral dispensation to start doing things that otherwise would be wrong, right? It's just kind of arbitrary. But what I was saying was, I was saying, what's bad? I was saying not accepting bad. So I don't know. People say, well, how is the government going to function without taxation? You don't have to know the answer. That's what I keep saying, is that you don't need to start with a conclusion in order to get started. As a matter of fact, it's the exact wrong way to get started. What you do is you start by building on what you know. And so you'd get to the right answer. And I have a pretty clear idea, but I'm not going to get all into it. But you don't need to know the conclusion. But I use that because it's a great illustration of what I mean by you don't need to know the conclusion. As a matter of fact, if you think you do know the conclusion before you start, you're probably screwing it up. You're probably pulling a script or a template in from your memory, your model, and those are fine to use as building blocks or to put kind of on the outside parts of your page, your mental page, where the center of the page is the answer to your problem. On the top of the page might be the question. How do I make money with OMG? How do I make money in general? How do I not experience pain with trauma? How do I not procrastinate? And then you leave the center blank and you just start writing, either metaphorically or literally, either working on it in your head or you're literally writing some stuff on paper. But remember, writing on paper is words, but words should represent scenarios. Writing down words should not take the place of again, they should work with and flesh out and express relationships between scenarios. So let me make sure I chart off that thread and then I'll continue. The thread had to do with identity. And so if you get your identity wrong, which everybody basically does in some way, shape, or form, even religions or philosophies that say you're not your body, then they end up saying that you're some sort of your true self or whatever. That's still conceptually, it's part of your mind, but you aren't your mind. You are not the processing of your brain. You're not the ideas in your brain. You're not the voice that's talking to yourself in your head. That's all presented to you. It's given to you. You're certainly attached to your mind and brain. But you are you can't be something that changes. Oh, and if you just are willing to not fudge stuff that you know has to be true. People are we have such at the deepest part of the way that we think. We need to stop having this idea of fitting, where you're trying to fit stuff into your model, and fudging to make stuff fit. That's what people do, is they fudge all over the place to make stuff fit. So they have a sense of control, and so they feel like they can move forward in life. As long as that's your deepest thing, which it may still be for you, then you're not going to get what you want out of life, out of LOI. I mean, you might get what you want circularly by wanting crap, by accepting, bad. And someone might live a very happy life, but they still have plenty of bad, typically. So, collecting my thoughts again here. I was saying that fitting, and then there's a particular thing that I wanted to point out that people fit. Is it their identity? Right. So when someone, I think this is what I was going to say. When someone starts to try to figure out who they are, I was saying don't leave. This is what happens. I'll point out something that has to be correct, such as if something changes, it can't be the same exact thing. Right? That's what the word change means. It's very simple. Something changes, it's gone. It doesn't exist anymore, actually. It's even a contradiction in terms to say something changed. You might say, well, what do you say? Well, once again, you don't need to know what the answer or the conclusion is in order to realize that something is wrong. So it can't be right to say something changed. If it changed, it's gone, right? And there's something else in its place. So you cannot be something that changes, or else you'd already be gone and you wouldn't be there anymore. So you have to be something that does not change. And no matter, and what people will do is they don't realize this, but they haven't abandoned the idea that their deepest thing, that the model for the world is that it has to fit. And so they'll fudge stuff like that. They'll affirm, oh yeah, I see what you mean, David, but then they won't stick with it, and they'll just kind of fudge stuff and leave it blurry and maintain other ideas that violate that. And you see, if something that changes can't be you, or else you'd be gone, or if it can't, there's no such thing as something can change, then you cannot be anything that could change, and yourself can change. Your brain can change. Your mind can change. And that's all you need to know. You don't need to know anything else. It's no more complicated than that. The complicated part lies in getting to the point where you stop twisting that. And then as long as your identity is that you're this body or mind or even this true self, then there's still this metaphor or this model you have about goals where it's something that can be stopped and so forth. And instead, it's something like not accepting that bad is ultimately necessary. Have faith. I realize some people might not believe in God, but if you do believe in God, it can be a little bit of a shortcut. Have faith that bad is not necessarily need to be the case in the world. The possibility of bad, of course, needs to exist, and it does exist, and so forth. But the possibility of bad exists. But bad does not have to exist at all, and it's due to a lack of understanding, and it can be resolved. And it's always going to come. Another hint is it always comes from contradictions. Let me see here. I'm reading now some questions. Okay. A further question, which is on the same thread, so I'll continue with it for a second. So to understand exactly what you're saying, I'm reading a question now, is just keep working at something and look to understand a particular task, but don't look at the end goal. But then why do people say that you should think about what you want when you become successful? All right, here's how it works. You are not your brain. Your brain is this wonderfully powerful mechanism that's leverage, and it's a tool, and it's your whole interface with the world. So the fact that you're not your brain doesn't mean you don't want to take massive advantage of it. You absolutely do. All your thinking, all your results are going to come from yourself. So you want to put yourself, think of it a little bit like a joint venture partner, right? Just like if you were me and you had OMG and you got to work with Greg, and you think, I'm sorry, and I'm not comparing either one of us to who's the being and who's the brain or anything. I'm just saying that from my perspective, let's say I'm trying to put Greg in the best position, or whatever, or any kind of JV partner. But think of it like you're working. So that metaphor works to a certain extent, but then it doesn't work when obviously I shouldn't be comparing a person ultimately to a self, which is not a person. Anyhow, so I'll backtrack off that, but it still illustrated the concept in a sense. So you want to take full advantage. You want to put yourself and your brain in the right position. In order to do that, you want to walk through. I give this in the results formula shortcut, which is still awesome, and it's the first video on the 2013 series that I have labeled as that, I believe it's called. But it's in my law of implication training. You can find it. It's called the results formula. And in order to get your brain maximally focused, including all the subconscious of it and all that stuff, focused, you do want to work through, and you want to picture what it'll be like after you achieve a goal and how awesome that'll be. And then you can even connect that up and see how, by getting in front of a computer and building your understanding and working at it, then that'll obviously lead to you achieving the goal. But picturing what actually, in this case, also, you don't exactly want to picture your goal so much as you picture what will happen after your goal. Of course, you have to think about your actual goal in order to think about what will happen after it, but you mostly want to picture what will happen after it. Like you're spending the money, you're telling your parents, your friends, oh my gosh, I made it work. This is awesome. I can't believe it. And it's terrific, and so forth. So that's a very useful exercise in order to get your brain aligned, creatively aligned on a task. So I recommend that absolutely. Separately, the way that you want to approach the idea of pursuing a goal is that you are building on what you know and building understanding. So that I think that's a good enough answer for dealing with that for the time being. So do them; those don't contradict. Those are two separate strategies for two separate situations. You want to get your brain aligned, but you don't need a background model for how goals work that involves expectations, norms, standards, and the idea that of being frustrated. You can picture your brain is totally motivated So imagine that you get your brain totally motivated to make $20,000 a month using, within the OMG framework. Then it could be fully motivated, and then the strategy that's going to follow, it's going to keep accumulating more stuff that it knows, and more experiences, and more resources, and you can imagine feeling good the whole way through. That's great, but then you can imagine if a so-called obstacle comes up, then you just keep on building understanding somewhere, somehow, until you get around, through, or under the obstacle, right? The obstacle is only the existence of whether something's an obstacle is fully arbitrary based on your arbitrary expectations. If I wake up, I've used the illustration, if I wake up tomorrow and I decide that the coffee shop is only 1 minute away rather than 5 minutes away, then I could be upset, like, oh my gosh, it's so far. It's actually, it's farther than I thought. So how or if someone just expects that it's going to take 3 months to succeed with OMG, but it takes 6 months, then it's just arbitrary that they pick 3. Or if they didn't realize that a particular quote unquote obstacle was going to come up and take them an extra 2 weeks, it was always going to be the case that that was going to come up. So it's purely a matter of again, like arbitrary perspective or expectations to think that something that it was always going to come up. Let's say the Comcast goes out for 2 weeks, then that was always going to happen, right? It's not. I was always going to have to work through that in order to achieve my goal, if that makes sense. And so whatever comes up, that's reality. Acknowledge it and just keep building understanding. You can work through what would happen if you just get frustrated. Is that going to help? Obviously not. So just work through the scenario of, gee, maybe the strategy of really getting frustrated and upset and storming off and giving up for a month is going to be effective. Oh wait, no, that's not going to be, right? As soon as you picture it. Again, we assume that our brain actually worked through that itself, but it doesn't. That's the point I tried to make earlier. It's actually a revelation. It could be total news to your brain to just picture what happens if you get frustrated for a while and upset and don't really work efficiently and procrastinate or whatever. Believe it or not, your brain never actually worked through that until you went through the scenario with it. Identity, you are not your mind. I'm reading a question. You are not your mind or self. Then what is our identity? Totally valid question, but just remember that you don't need to know what something is in order to start. You need to know the question, who are we? That's good, great question. And then you just build on what you know. What you can know is that whatever your identity is, it can't be something that changes. The way that I build my understanding of who I am is I realize that I'm conscious of stuff that feels like it's in my head, stuff that feels like it's visually around the world and that I hear audioly or hear in my head, memories, all that stuff, I'm aware of it. And there must be something that's aware of that. That something theoretically doesn't have to change, right? The contents of what I'm aware of change, and then the memories and everything in my brain and the storage mechanism and my body that I have, that can all change. But I am some unchanging being that's aware of my consciousness field, and I'm able to not accept bad as ultimately necessary. Doesn't mean I get angry at bad stuff and shake my finger at it, or that I get upset at myself. But what I do is I realize that I don't have enough understanding yet, and that means I'm not realizing some contradiction. And so then I use the method I've laid out in the rundown and overview series toward the last few videos, number 10, I believe. And other videos, recordings around number 10, to work through that. It is more the feelings of achieving it than the actual goal. I think that's exactly right in terms of if you feel, let's say you picture what'll happen, how you'll feel, a clear scenario in your mind. What'll happen if you're making like $20,000 a month? And then maybe something a little specific about how you did that. If you're just, the reason I then say within the OMG framework is not because you have to operate within the OMG framework, but of course it's just very likely if you're on OMG, it makes sense to work within OMG at this point. And it's okay if you had no idea how to go about making 20,000, it'd be fine to keep that vague. But since you're an OMG, it probably makes sense to just go ahead and picture within an OMG framework, 20,000 a month. You want to picture it and what you would do after that, including just telling people about it. It doesn't have to be how you'd spend the money. Could be you save the money, some of it or whatever. But you want to picture it until you really feel jazzed about it. because that's a signal. It's not like you're motivating you as the conscious being. What you're doing is that's a signal that your brain got it. If you feel jazzed about what you're picturing, about the goal, then it means your brain's caught on to that it wants to achieve that it's installed in your brain most likely. Let me take a stab at a question. How can the law of implication help someone over addiction, any kind, drugs, food, work, etc., and excess? So once again, I don't know the answer to start with, and I'm going to follow my same method I always use that looks like magic toward, as it continues, which is that I just start with things that I know. And maybe it doesn't, I don't try to figure out the most efficient or the closest thing to the right answer that I know. I just think of something, and then it continues from there. So now one thing with addiction is I would make sure that it's not helpful. Like I would make sure that it's not just someone else deciding that it's not something we want to be supposedly addicted to. And then what you want to try to understand there's some good about it. When you have a mix, when you have any situation where there's a mix of good and bad, right? And pretty much that has to be the case with addiction, right? Like the very nature of what the word must mean is that there's some sort of positive payoff to what's going on, but then long term, it seems to take you, there seems to be some inherent contradiction where you have less resources of some sort, time, money, health, or whatever, and those are resources that we're stipulating in this case will give you more good in the future. So let me explicitly stipulate that. Let's stipulate that there's some resources where if you have more of them, it'll help you to have more good. All right, so more health. Now that doesn't mean that it's actually that you should feel bad about having less resources. There's a difference between more good stuff and bad. But regardless, so let's stipulate that if you have more health, more money, more time, then you can use that and trade that basically for more good stuff. So in that way, we want it. And then the addiction, we'll say, is eating that up, right? It's eating up resources, time, health, something like that. Now, we can also know that spending resources to get good experience is correct, is theoretically correct. Now, I wouldn't want to spend $1 million for like a massage, right? Most typically, presumably. Now, when I do that, I'm using the extreme test to shed light on something. So what that shows me is that I also want to try to be efficient with how I spend my resources. However, let's suppose the opposite. Let's suppose I never want to spend resources, time, excuse me, money, or even potentially health on actual goodness, like conscious experience of goodness. That doesn't make sense either, right? So I do want to spend resources, but I want to do so efficiently. And we can also notice that if you spend all your resources like on the next 5 minutes, that couldn't be efficient because then you have no resources for the rest of the time. Ideally, we didn't want to spend our resources in a way where it's some sort of investment where we actually both get good and we end up with both more goodness and more resources, which can happen, right? Like if you work or even if you go on a date, that may be a case where you're spending some time, but you have more good, but you have more. And this brings me to a new realization. There's an idea also of net resources. Maybe I spend a little bit. If I could spend 1 hour, just be extreme again, 1 hour and get $1 million, then I did spend an hour, but I got $1 million, and I would probably suppose that my net resources are higher at that point, right? There's a little bit of a gray area at some point, but there's no gray area with 1 hour for $1 million probably. So if I spend a little bit of time, then and if I enjoy myself on a date, and then on top of that, I have a resource of a relationship with a person, right? A person ultimately, like the being, they're not a resource, but a relationship with people can usefully and correctly be thought of as a resource. So, and by the way, this is how I discover stuff. Is I'll be trying to answer one question, and then I start building on what I know, building out scenarios like I'm doing right now, and then I'll even accidentally discover other things that I didn't even realize I was, looking for. And in a sense, we're a little bit doing that now. I'm not like pointing out this or that. or necessarily, but probably we're shedding light on some other related areas as we do this. That also illustrates the opposite problem of when I start out trying to teach people about law of implication. There's so many ideas that people don't have, that everything I say touches on other ideas that then those need explanation, and so we kind of get lost at first, and it's kind of inevitable. But what do? You just put one foot in front of the other and seek understanding. Myself and you guys too. Okay, so back to this question and the scenario we're building out. We notice that we're exploring this for now from the perspective of resources. We can note that it's fine to spend time in order to get a different type of resource, and especially if we enjoy our time, then we really make out, where we have fun on the date, we spend a little bit of time and money, but we end up with a relationship. Now, certainly you can go on a date and not end up with that, but I'm stipulating that we do. I'm just showing you that it can be possible, that it's possible, or illustrating a concept. So we do want to spend resources, but we want to spend them efficiently, and we actually ideally want to spend them in a way where we enjoy ourselves now, and we end up with more net resource in the future. Generally in life, we can keep on doing that. We can keep on spending our time now in a way that's enjoyable, and we end up with even more tomorrow, right? That's pretty doable in life. And if we aren't currently doing that, then that's a great question. You can put that at the top of an actual notebook page and say, how can I spend my resources tomorrow or in general so that I can both enjoy myself during the day and come out with more resources? Part of that answer might be, how do I enjoy doing tasks that are good for me, right? Which in and of itself might shed light on the addiction issue. It seems like with the addiction problem, then you are getting some goodness now, you're spending some resources, you might even be efficient in one sense, but you're not getting a return on your investment with an addiction, is what seems like it's revealing itself as I work through this, where you end up with less net resources as time goes on, and your life kind of shrinks. Just walking through that carefully, again, this is an example where I'm not saying that this one thing will solve it or not, but by piling on what you know, you make progress, and this may solve it all by itself, and it may not. But if you remember, I keep reminding you that your brain does not actually, nor does it have the effect of walking through the scenarios like this already until you do it. And so if you walk through the scenario of the addiction, where you see how you have less resources like in total in your life, that you might experience goodness by taking the drug or eating the thing, but you have less resources overall in the future, then and that might even be a good actual scenario constructed definition of an addiction, that's more clear than just normally what people do by default is they identify concepts as if they just in a way where they triangulate, like they can pick it out of a lineup, where they just have a bunch of examples of supposed addictions in their head, and then of that their mind kind of forms a conglomerate or archetype or something, and they can distinguish it in most cases from non-addictions, just like you can distinguish a cat from other animals, unless something's close enough to it. Then you're not quite sure, is that a cat, is that not a cat, or is that an addiction, is it not an addiction? By building it in this way, and I'm doing this as we speak, so that doesn't mean I've checked this over so much that I want to put my full stamp of approval on it, but we can start to see a working idea that's pretty clear and maybe a little unique in its clarity, of what an addiction is, which is something where we feel like doing something, even though we have a pretty good idea that we have less resources overall at each new day. Like we're not investing. It's like the opposite of investing. Spending to get something good is fine, but for the most part, we want to invest. Although even that idea that we want to invest is, at some point, sometimes it's easily could be possible that you could just fully spend resources and they're gone, and you haven't even got anything back, but you got a good experience out of it, a good few days out of it, and that might be totally fine. Right? If you spend $5 and have a great week and get nothing out of it, that sounds good to me. So even then, as I check over it, we want to be careful about how we put it. So an addiction would end up being something where you look at the overall, you yourself go through and you look at the overall spending of the resource. And you're like, this is clearly not a gray area. It's clearly just an inefficient use of my resources, where there's this urge from my brain to take this drug or do this thing or eat these foods. But clearly, I'm not getting even a good return on what I'm spending. Even if I'm not even getting much out of my purchase. Not only am I not coming out with more resources the next day, but even the amount less that I have, I'm spending too much for this goodness. Or I'm spending too much if I could get that much goodness somewhere else. And so, another thing that I did now just think of that's a little separate relating to addictions is a good rule in general. There's a story of Orpheus, which is pretty cool. It illustrates a pretty cool concept. By contrast, when Odysseus was going past the Sirens on a sea vessel he was on, then he asked his crew members to tie him physically to the mast so that because he wanted to hear the sirens, and they had to tie him because otherwise he would be beguiled by their call and he would lose himself. He would go out there. But he thought that if you tie me to the mast, then I can hear their call, and I always wanted to hear them. And then they did that. Apparently, I guess it worked out okay. It may or may not have. I don't know how the part of the story ends. You can look it up. But then there's a cool counterpoint to that, which is with Orpheus. And I believe I have these facts right about mythology. Obviously it's not historical, but even mythology, I believe I have the mythology right. If I ever get a fact wrong, it shouldn't affect my reasoning. With Orpheus, what he did was he was such a beautiful musician that he played his music when they went past the sirens, and it was a lure of like a greater desire, of like a greater thing. And so they weren't tempted by the siren song because his music was even more beautiful. And that's a cool concept that you can have as in your toolbox in life, where one of the things you can do potentially with an addiction is find something even more awesome that you might be able to do instead. So a few different potential, and you can do all of these at once. I like to try to intervene in a number of places in the feedback loop or in the factors or the vectors, and try to just clear out every single vector that's leading me in the wrong direction, and then it becomes easy. And so you can work through the scenario in your mind of seeing how it's not a very good use of your resources. And you can say, well, what if it isn't a bad use of my resources? Then it must not be an addiction that you want to get rid of. Right? If it's just something where you're spending resources and you enjoy it. There's a kind of a funny way of looking at eating. Where what if I said, hey, I developed a method where you can sleep for 2 hours on a particular day. You can sleep for 2 hours and it makes all your food taste really good for the whole day. Then sometimes you might want to do that, right? Not so bad. And so ironically, that's just a different way, perhaps. It's a fair way of phrasing the idea that certain foods make you tired and you have less energy, right? But let's say you eat certain foods that make you tired and have less energy in a particular day. And if it's limited to just that day, then you maybe sleep 2 hours or you don't accomplish as much that day, but you got to eat food that was particularly tasty. If kale just is never ever going to taste as good to you, I'm not saying it is, but if we stipulate that, and that might not be correct, that might be false. It might be that kale and green drink and bean sprouts can taste just wildly better than whatever you just really naturally like. Or it may be that you can lead your brain to where they do taste that good. I don't take that for granted, though, that that's the case. I haven't gotten to that point where that's the case myself. I have people report that it totally works for them. It also literally might be specific to the person. With some people, smoking does something for them biochemically that it doesn't do for other people. And so it really works for them. And maybe literally they're not even wrong that having a few less years on their life, maybe it is worth it. But at least to figure out whether it's worth it, they should work through the scenario and imagine withering and dying early, and really picturing that vividly and clearly, and then they can at least compare better about whether it's worth it. I'm not being sarcastic when I say that. I'm actually being literal when I say that. So look at it pretty clearly from a pragmatic standpoint, and by being willing to look at it clearly, you also will get more clear if it is an addiction. So by willing to look at it either way, then you can, and then again, by walking through the scenarios, theoretically, the fact that if you walk through the scenario, you would see it is not the same thing as actually doing it. Your brain does not walk through scenarios by itself. Well, thank you, my goodness. I think I'll frame this. Someone wrote, is this guy for real? It's just brilliant. Thank you. I certainly appreciate that. Someone wrote, "Oh, I love kale, lol, especially kale soup. It's a Portuguese thing, lol, but it's so good." Okay, great. Well, and maybe you might, but maybe also. Anyway, but I am in no way saying it may completely be the case that all you have to do is, is eat certain the right foods for a little while and they taste better. Although I just think it's funny to point out that if it's on a limited scale, that the trade-off of being more tired for a day but having your food be really tasty is something that you might choose once in a while, which is kind of a funny way to look at it. That's another example though where I don't have any conclusion from that. I'm not using that as to build a case. In no way am I making a case that you should eat unhealthily or whatever, or eat foods that sap your energy, or I'm not trying to justify. I'm pointing out something that's true, which is just that that's a different way to look at it. And then that can help you arrive at the correct conclusion ultimately. We call that Thanksgiving. Okay, so I think that, okay, someone wrote something further about the addict, but the addict is overpowered by his addiction. How can he even contemplate or analyze all this? The way is LOI gives you a way to change the game in a unique way that you can't do otherwise. And one of the ways to think about it is there's different ways to begin, but they all lead to the same place. But when you realize fully, when you come to understand by disproving the opposite or whatever, that you cannot possibly be your brain, then you start to pervasively look at what you previously called your thoughts or your beliefs. And you see, when you identify with your brain and your thoughts, then they're protected in a different way. And you literally feel changing your mind. If you identify with your mind, as people do, then changing one's mind feels like an attack. Because remember, I talked about how change means like you're literally killing one thing. It's gone. It's out. It's gone. It's just fully gone. It's replaced with something else. So if you identify with your brain, then changing it feels like death. People still do it, but they're conflicted because there's this kind of deep feeling that it's logically related to death. So you want to develop the habit pervasively of taking thoughts that come from your brain as a starting point rather than an ending point, no matter how certain the conclusion is. And then also realizing that your goals, normally the way people are is the way that their goals are currently configured, that's what they want to pursue. A next thing you can do is start to rearrange your goals consistently on the fly. They can be much more flexible than they normally are. And so the more you pervasively get used to not identifying with your brain, not identifying with your mind, not taking a conclusion from your mind as a conclusion, but instead as a suggestion or a starting point, then it opens you up where even if you have a total addiction, you have a different ability to step outside of it. Same thing, even including if you get like drunk or you're on drugs. I don't attempt this often or whatever, but if that's the case, then I tend to be far more congruent or the same if I'm intoxicated than otherwise. Or even like pain, the more you get used to the idea that, like physical pain, the more you get used to the idea that you don't have to believe that you ever should feel bad. You can take pain as a signal and it doesn't like hurt in the same way, like if you get injured or whatever. Does repeated exposure to or studying the LOI courses cause cancer? Now, courses improve the ratio of operating in the correct model instead of the default models in thinking? Okay, good question. And when you gain correct ideas or when you filter out bad ideas, that's happening in your brain, and so your brain gets configured better. It is stored in your brain, so you're changing the default by seeking understanding, by being exposed to me. Presumably, I am not at all claiming to be infallible. However, I do check over what I say pretty clearly, and you're going to get pretty good stuff from me, relative to what you would get without me. So exposure to LOI, let's say, let's stipulate that there's a person who's teaching LOI and they're doing a perfect job of it. Then exposure to that will configure generally give you better templates, and you'll be better off. You definitely want to get make sure that you consciously get and it have as part of your kind of ongoing experience the deepest idea of that you're not going to accept bad, that it's not the case that you should feel bad. The general problem solving technique and technique in general of not equating how things seem with how they are. That's important. It's actually an open question. I'm still trying to understand more and more about what gets stored in your brain and then what you have to kind of consciously add to things consistently. But a lot of it can get stored. But I'll work on that and I'll try to get an even better answer. LOI causes cancer. You heard it here first, folks. That's great. All right, let me see if there's anything. Might start to wrap up here. I haven't answered everything. I will. Let me look actually while I'm on here. Let me make sure. Nope, Control A doesn't work. Does anyone know technically, I don't know if Mike's listening and he knows, do you know how to save the questions on the question box? Now they don't show up on the screen, but I want to.
David.
Yeah.
There's a PDF report that we can get from the back office of GoToWebinar, and it contains all the questions. I believe they're time-stamped. It might be maybe the best way to work with it.
Oh, great. So that's done automatically.
Yeah, it's in the back office of GoToWebinar.
Thank you. Great. Okay. Thank you. Great. All right. I'm going to search this.
By the way, I'll throw my 2 cents. Just terrific today, as always. Thanks.
Say again, Mike.
Oh, just to throw in my 2 cents. I really enjoyed everything today.
Thank you very much. Okay, so what I'm doing now, I'm going to see if there's any other questions that particularly pop out. Not that they're good or bad or whatever, but then I'll have the questions stored and we'll kind of continue the process from there. I'm not trying to overlook anyone's questions, but I knew from the beginning I wasn't going to necessarily try to get to every question. And a little bit of what I get to is somewhat even random, just based on what I happen to come to with my eyes sometimes while I'm in flow. Okay. One person asks, one of the things I have difficulty with is the practical application within my life. And I'm going to interrupt my reading the question for a second. And I really, of course, expect this. And this is obviously part of why we're trying to do these, why I do everything I do. And this webinar, the live webinars, but I'm going to give a bit of an answer as well. But that's where I expect people to kind of be at is, we're making progress, but sometimes it's hard, in some cases, hard to figure out how to apply things. I'm going to continue reading the question. I'll just read the whole thing again. One of the things I have difficulty with is the practical application within my life. The attitude and frustration parts and being less self-centered. I understand in theory, but have difficulty changing toward being the person I want to be. And so particularly the attitude and frustration parts and being less self-centered. Very possibly, this was asked at 3:11, so it was asked about 2 hours ago. Probably some of the things I said began to be helpful with this, but I think I had a thought. Let me see if I can get it back here. I know. Let me just point out to you that you can have a physical notebook, like one of paper, and a pen, and you can write a question down, and then you could even sleep on it and so forth. You also have my method of working through it specifically with scenarios. Just don't do this where you just write questions and then you're taking a shower and then you have some thoughts and you're like, oh, maybe that's the answer. Because that's first you're just going to get some templates and stuff that your brain's going to pull in from associations in your current model. But those thoughts are still helpful. You still can write them down because there's still potential building blocks. Just don't take them as final answers. But if you write with a notebook and write down questions, and then Another thing that's going to happen besides building scenarios in your head, you can use your notebook. You can hone in on particular words. So for example, with this question, one of the keywords is attitude, another is like frustration and self-centered. And you can ask like what does it mean? What causes frustration, or what are the components for frustration? Now that's one of the answers also I've given you, which is, or I've given you at some point somewhere in my recordings, doesn't mean that you've heard it. But I've given you some of the building blocks today. Once you start with a model in life where you're identified with yourself, which is incorrect to identify with yourself. Yourself is yourself. It's attached to you. It's a tool. It's useful. It does all sorts of stuff. But it isn't you where you want to identify fully with it. Much like you don't want to fully identify with a video game character that you control. You could say that guy's me within a video game, and there's a correctness to that. And you don't like not want to use that character. If you're playing the game, the character is important to interact with the game. Anyhow, when you identify with yourself and then you end up, without realizing it, you picture goals as something where you're trying to travel a distance toward them, where either through time or through space, and where you have an expectation of what obstacles are going to come up and what won't, and where the path is going to be clear and where it won't. And what you can realize is, first of all, those expectations are arbitrary. They're just a random guess that didn't even come from thinking it through with scenarios. Generally, just your brain just kind of arbitrarily picks what obstacles are natural and expected and what are unexpected, and how long it's expected to take, and so forth. Once you operate that, once you have that backdrop, then you're set up for failure. And when an obstacle, all that has to happen is an unexpected obstacle has to come up, and then you're either going to feel angry or frustrated. You're going to feel angry if you feel like the obstacle came from either neglect or the intent of a person, where they should not have done that thing, or they should have not neglected and whatever. Or you're going to feel frustrated if you feel like it's not a person that did it through neglect or intention, but just sort of something like from the universe, so to speak, that's not a person. Then you'll feel frustrated. As soon as you set things up in the wrong way, or in the typical way, but it's wrong. It's wrong in the sense of the right way. If we stipulate that the right way would be the one that would give you the most efficiency and happiness, then you set yourself up that way. Then you're just going to predictably feel frustrated whenever it's like having a receptor from a cell. If it's set up so that a particular unwanted hormone, if it's set up in a certain way where that unwanted hormone will stick to it, then predictably, through quote unquote bad luck or whatever, you're going to get these bad hormones sticking. So it's in one way, that enables you to see how it's partly luck, but it's also going to necessarily happen over time that you're going to feel frustrated. So you want to break outside of that. The game is rigged for failure. You instead want to rig it so you can't help but be successful in both being happy and efficient. And then the way to do that is through understanding more and more about what I mean by who you really are. You're a being. You don't move. You don't change. You're aware of what you're aware of, your consciousness field. You want to be happy and experience goodness. You want the same for other people. You want that for all time. And so your goals are only to serve that. Just like if someone makes a video game, if you're a video game programmer, or you make a board game or any sort of game, even if or you could picture this if you're making a game for kids, right? Let's say you're watching a group of kids and you're making a game for them. The whole purpose of the game is for the kids to have fun and maybe to learn something, right? Practice something. That's it. Within that, so you still set up rules and even obstacles and challenges within that game, but the only purpose of it is for them to have fun and to learn. If they don't do that, if they get wrapped up in the game in an incorrect way, so it's perfectly correct for them to take the game seriously. Like you can take a game seriously in a certain way and both fully have fun without feeling bad and learn something, right? There's a way that you can take a game seriously, but there's a way that you can rig it wrong, like I described, where you have it all set up where you'll feel frustrated if you don't win the game, right? And it's kind of easy to picture with kids. But there's a way that they can do it right, the kids and you, and there's a way they can do it wrong. And if they do it wrong, there's no benefit to that wrongness. It's purely less fun, less enjoyable, and less learning takes place. And it's purely a conceptual mistake, right? They can take the game seriously and get into it without identifying so strongly within that game that they can't step out of it, and when they lose, realize, hey, someone else won, it's all good, we're trying to have fun. At the same time, they don't want to take it so unseriously that they don't even perform up to the challenge, because then it's not as much fun for the person to win who does win, and then they don't learn as much if they don't take it seriously in the correct way. So just like kids in that game, or that you rig the game so it's good, rig your goals that way. The only point of any goal that you have ever is for you to ultimately just experience goodness, and other people to experience goodness. There's never any reason for a goal, but your brain will treat it differently. Your brain doesn't have a concept of goodness in the way that you do, because your brain is not conscious. And the ramifications, the logical consequences that your brain is not conscious are really, really profound. Because we identify with our brain, our mind, and so forth, we presume that our mind is conscious, that our self is conscious, but it's not. Once you stop identifying with it, you differentiate and you realize it's not. So it doesn't have the idea of goodness. It's like just a goal-achieving mechanism. Your brain, it's like a robot in a sense. It's going to just go after the goal, but you don't want to buy into it in a certain way. The whole point of it doing that is just for you to experience goodness, and for other people too, and for you to accumulate resources, for you to experience more goodness in the future. That's it. So if you keep that in mind, then that should hopefully help you to reframe your whole model, so that, and it's much more efficient. You can much more effectively make money and so forth. And also when you're dealing with other people, I'm able to treat my joint venture partners and coaches and members in OMG with respect pervasively. And there's not like this invisible line that they know if they cross, then David's going to go ballistic. It doesn't mean I'm weak. I stand up for myself and so forth. But I don't just use behaviorism on people. And by crossing off behaviorism, it forces me to find ways to operate in a way that I might not have thought of, because behaviorism is always going to, once it's on the table, it's always going to seem like it's more effective, because it's quicker and easier. But if you take it off the table because you realize where it leads, then it forces you to find solutions where not only do you get what you want short term, but then you're better off for the long term. And so by doing that, then you also remember how you did it, and so you get better at doing it in the future, and you develop and develop and develop. And so in what I do to make money, I developed the skill where I don't work in a corporate structure. Most people that are in a position that seems analogous to mine, they're in a corporate structure where they can tell people what to do. Everyone I work with is in a sense a volunteer. I mean, they get money and so forth, but they're not like employees. And even if I was dealing with employees, I would still want to deal the same way, because people are ultimately volunteers even if they're employees, right? They're not full-on slaves, and even a slave can try to escape and so forth. So but this talent is particularly helpful when you're dealing with in the online world, where there's a lot more joint ventures than there used to be, right, in the world probably. And so this is a useful talent for you guys as well, to develop. But by not operating that way myself, where I'm getting angry and frustrated, then I can be confident. I can not be flexible in a place where I know it's wrong and so forth. But I don't need to just get frustrated and upset with people. Okay, I think I'll end this here. Let me see. Actually, there's one thing just right to the point. Do we rig goals like you say to just step outside of the game mentally? Not sure if I understand exactly what. Do we rig goals like you say to just step out of the game mentally? Rigging goals. One thing you can do is just picture. Just do this. Imagine that any particular goal that you're going after. You can do this with various goals to get it integrated in your mind. But picture some of the major things you're going after, and imagine that you just approach it the right way. Remember, your brain doesn't know the scenarios until you go through it, or it doesn't take into account. It doesn't operate as if it has the knowledge that you get when you take it through scenarios. So picture that picture you're trying to make money with OMG. And then picture that you have an expectation, but picture how that makes no sense to you. Like, let's say you picture, all right, I decide it's going to take 3 months, or I decide that by the time I talk to 10 prospective clients, one of them is going to say yes. And then ask yourself, is that a helpful thing to expect, or is there any real reason why I'm expecting that? And then the answer is obviously no. And then imagine an obstacle comes up that you didn't expect. Then think, well, wait, wasn't that always going to actually happen? In reality, I didn't know it was going to happen ahead of time, but it was always, in a matter of speaking, it was always going to happen. So it's natural in that sense. And so I'm only me relative to who I am. That was always going to happen. And so how do I want to respond? I just want to keep on gaining understanding, gaining resources, gaining leverage, gaining practice, experience, and just keep on getting more and more leverage toward the goal until the goal naturally gets achieved, right? And if you walk your brain through that scenario and you do that with various goals, then pretty much you'll be that might just be very effective for you. Ultimately, you want to understand more and more. So there's not like some time in which you want to quit using LOI and quit understanding more deeply, but that should get you most of where you're trying to go in a lot of cases just by picturing it the right way. And that helps to rig the game properly with goals. Okay, and all the kind comments, thank you so much. So it said what's written on the second slide. I'll probably just cover this on a recording. I just had this in case, but it was terrific. It's much better and more questions than I expected. Actually, I genuinely didn't know if I really got questions or if people just wouldn't know what to say or what to ask. Oh, thank you. Thanks for all the continuing stuff as well. Here, I'll show you the other slide if you want. I covered understanding is fitting a little bit. What was this here? Maintaining the illusion of control. I mentioned that briefly. And then closing your eyes. I did refer to this within the context of something I was talking about. And I plan to elaborate more on this and perhaps prepared recordings that are coming up as well. But this worked great. I really enjoyed it, was able to cover a lot. And I still plan to try out doing some even audio back and forth with people at some point. I don't know whether I'll do it next time or not. And I also want to see, what I'll probably do is give it about maybe a few sessions and then see how well I've answered a lot of the questions. It's natural on the first webinar for there to particularly be a lot, perhaps, of questions where I wouldn't be able to get to all of them, but maybe after 3 or 4, I actually will have answered enough that I'll be able to get to them all. I'll get a sense. I have no idea. I don't really want it to be one way or the other, but I want to kind of give it a chance to see. If not, I'll look for a way to get all questions answered one way or the other, either by going even longer or having more webinars, one way or the other. So great. And you're so very welcome. This is what I'm devoting my life to pretty much. So it's great for me to get this practice, and we can spread this and get these correct ideas in people's heads. All right. I guess I'll be ending the webinar. I guess I'll give you a minute to finish typing in any things you're typing in, so I won't end it for another 2 minutes or so. But I'll be pretty much done. Thank you so much, guys. And I'll do another one in something like a week or so. And I see one or so other questions coming in, and I'll again look to make sure I answer them all over the next over time, and not too much time either, as best as I can, if it's possible. There's one thing I can actually say as we're wrapping up here. Someone asked, how can you know when you've achieved understanding? It has to do with matching and mismatching. Mismatching is often what's going to happen. Matching takes a little harder because you have to boil something down to just enough bits of information that you can fit it all kind of on your same screen. But you understand something if you can look at 2 concepts or things, even literally if it's just a plate and a cup, and you look at a plate and a cup and you say, those are definitely different. There's something very different going on between the plate and the cup. That's understanding something, seeing how 2 things don't match. Each and every time you see how something doesn't match, then there's a type of understanding and distinction and new categories and new places that are created in your brain. Your brain is actually a matching machine, like a connection machine, an association machine. Everything your brain does is pretty much based on associating. And so it's like having, this is not a perfect metaphor, but a little bit like having an accelerator or a brake, where if your brain's like the accelerator, then without the brake, and again, it's not a perfect metaphor, don't read too much into it, it's not like you're just a brake, but every time you say that something does not match, then your brain basically creates a new space, and that's related to understanding. So that can give you at least an indication you can think about that. And the ultimate not matching is not saying that bad matches good. That's the fundamental matching mistake that people make, is bad is good and good is bad. You should means should ultimately should mean that it leads to good, right? That's the only real meaning of should that's going to ultimately make any sense. And bad does not lead to good. Bad's just bad. Bad leads to more bad, basically. And it comes from contradictions, which leads to more bad. I totally made my day. I like that comment. All right, I'll give it one more minute or so, and then I'll end it. But we're all set here. Thank you so much, guys. Oh, and I might do some of the social group responses at some point too, where people can post and just add things over time as I get more used to one part of the interface. Then I'll continue adding stuff. All right, I will stop it now as soon as I find the right button. Oh, here we go.